Hello all, I am back after a little bit of a mini family vacation, and no, that's not a short person joke, although nobody in this guy's family is seeing 6 foot or above, I can tell you that. But happy to be back and nerding out with you all. Mama, there goes that nerd again. I wanted to nerd out on something that I found fascinating in a little bit of a rabbit trail deep dive over the weekend. And that was, I was waking up at 6 a.m. on Saturday morning to watch some of the first matches of the new Premier League season. First part of being a nerd right there. And as I'm sitting there with my cup of coffee and enjoying the results of the fixtures, a shout out Leeds marching on together. Awesome, great first win there. First 3 points, love it. And as I'm watching all these incredibly talented athletes play and the different stats that pop up, this is what they did last year. Perhaps this is a new player coming into your club, and here were his stats in this other league previous year. Talking about incoming players still as the transfer window hasn't closed to bring in new players. And being like, this guy just needs to pass his medical, right, to be able to get in to his new club in the Premier League. As I'm hearing all this information, all these stats on the screen were being given, I start thinking, not only as a sports nerd enjoying this, but as a GRC nerd thinking about all that data. I start thinking about how the UK is, positioned within having to follow GDPR regulations and requirements, and how that all interacts and works. I think of the GDPR tenets of lawfulness, fairness, transparency, purpose, limitation that might have requirements for personal data such as this. And it's fascinating to me, at least, because there is so much data that is harvested, processed, distributed on these athletes, on these players, and how those things are processed by the Premier League and the clubs, and then where it goes from there. Obviously, their performances on the pitch, but things including like their race and origins, their history of medical and fitness, like health information. They even use facial scans of certain players along with tracking data, which includes pose and skeletal data, to provide to official EA sports or video games in producing realistic football games. I just started asking all the questions. What data is gathered? How is that data processed? What type of categories of data does that fall into? Who has access to it? Who is it sold to? For what purpose? Those types of questions. And I'll spare you from answering all of those in this video, but it was pretty fascinating. There are approximately over 1,200 players just within the clubs and the youth systems, the under 21s, for Premier League squads. That's a lot of people and a lot of information. Doesn't even take into account the players that might be coming from other leagues and other countries into the Premier League. And there's so much information that is known and impacts those decisions of hiring, of acquiring these players, or of selling them, or what their value truly is. And then on top of it, there is so much of that information that goes into betting companies and people that use that data for their own commercial use. Another instance that's growing is the Premier League just inked, I believe, a 5-year deal with Microsoft to use AI and train it on player data to create this fan experience chatbot type of venue for fans to watch alongside. The data is beyond just the performance on the pitch. It goes to their racial origins. It goes to their health and wellness, although there's different categories of data, so they have different requirements, right? Take health, for instance. We would know if a player is injured. That becomes public information, which is its own discussion for another time. But we wouldn't know their fitness levels or the monitoring that goes on there. That's usually kept within the club itself and often only shared club to club if they're acquiring or selling a player. There's racial origin data, right? And the Premier League states that they acquire this and keep this data to help promote the diversity of the sport. It's a global sport, football or soccer as we call it in the States. But what other possible use could that information have? There is also collection of the Academy players' education records, and that information is kept. And how is that used? Who is that shared with? A lot of these things relate mostly to a player that might move, we'll say company to company or club to club, but it still warrants the question on these policies that are in place, and then also if those policies are being followed. A policy is only as good as its implementation, and its implementation is only as good as its enforcement. So when you have all of this information about individuals, granted players in the public eye, but all this information about these players that is being shared publicly or shared within organization, shared with third parties, how is that handled? And specifically what I wanted to talk about is what rights do the players have? Is it just consent that's folded and kind of molded into the contracts? What rights should they have? What does GDPR give them for rights within this type of setup and arrangement? This information isn't just kept between the players and their club or the organizations they represent. It is shared with the league in general. It is shared with broadcasters and data companies that also use that information to build their companies, to make large amounts of money. Specifically, one of the things that's come into the public eye of late is some of those data sets are shared with companies like gambling sites that want to be able to build that into their algorithms, or even AI use in building of chatbots. Let's look at 10 rights that players have and maybe ask additional questions on those. First is the right to access. Players have the right to access their data. Needs to be in a way that is obvious to them, right? Second, right to rectification. Players have the right to make sure that the information being gathered on them is correct. Third is the right to erasure, often called the right to be forgotten. How realistic and how easy, how complete is it to erase the data from data sets or from third-party access? Fourth is the right to processing. What rights do the players, are they able to have in relation to allowing their information to be used in a specific case? The limitations of that processing. Fifth is the right to data portability. Now, this does not include the in-match data that's often talked about when we talk about the broad spectrum of player data. The sixth right is the right to object. Now, there is a loophole within the GDPR that the Premier League uses, which is called legitimate use. So a lot of this discussion, and I'll get into some of the friction of the data and how it's processed between the Premier League and between players or groups that are organized around this idea of giving the players more right to refusal of how their information is being used. What they do with the information, for instance, selling it to third parties or third-party access, and those third parties might sell it to gambling sites, or they might be gambling sites, or the use of that information to help train AI that is built to help fans interact with the game in a better way. The seventh thing is the right to lodge a complaint. I think this does enter into the idea of power imbalance. Sometimes it's difficult. How much does an employee or a player have for being able to stand and issue a complaint? How are those complaints handled? But specifically, complaining to somebody that writes your paycheck is a tough decision to make sometimes. Number 8 is right to a judicial remedy, but those things can often cost a lot of time, a lot of money. Number 9 is right to not be subject to automated decision making. These decisions are going to be made by people in charge and not just processes or algorithms. And then number 10, which is the right to obtain a copy of that personal information. So those are 10 rights that a player would have in how their information is used, processed, who it's given to, different checks and balance sort of that they are given in that. I want to get back to the 6th mentioned there, which is that player's right to object. The player has a right to object or to refuse to ask that the data being processed to be stopped, both through GDPR, also through the Premier League's player privacy policy. But what does that actually look like? So the player can object to certain things or certain ways that the data is being processed. When a player objects to the way that their data is being used or asks for that, the data controller has to stop processing the data for that specific use unless they can demonstrate that the need overrides the player's interests, rights, request. The Premier League even mentions that. They have, under the GDPR public interest category, the ability to maintain and process data as it relates to racial or ethnic diversity monitoring. But a player could ask for their information to not be used in that case, at which point they would have to stop. And there are reports showing that that does happen from time to time. Players, when they sign their contracts, probably are signing some of this consent. But within the GDPR, within the rules that are in place, there is the right to withdraw consent. The GDPR states that data subjects have the right to withdraw their consent at any time. The withdrawal of consent does not affect the lawfulness of the processing based on its consent before its withdrawal, but it does mean that the processing must cease at that point unless another legal basis exists. So while consent is a crucial legal basis for processing personal data, it is subject to more stricter conditions, and it's not always the appropriate or sufficient legal ground, especially in situations if there's an imbalance of power, which a player to a club, in my estimation, would be. This is what led me to Project Red Card, which is an ongoing legal battle or friction where about 850 former footballers are contesting how their personal data is used and whether or not that is a breach of data protection laws. The group is the Global Sports Data and Technology Group Limited, or the GSDT. And their aim is not merely to bring these organizations or these companies that are selling the data to gambling sites specifically to court. They're also looking to educate clubs and players on these important data issues, which I think is phenomenal. So what's the main ethical concern? Really at the heart of all of this is this idea that data of the players is being processed and harvested in bulk and then sold on to third parties. Obviously things like broadcasters and fantasy leagues, but also more controversially gambling companies. And this idea that the players' information could be sold to a company that maybe they have a moral obligation to, or maybe they don't receive any benefit from financially. As it stands, there is no legal requirement for firms to seek player consent to collect or monetize this data. However, under the GDPR, personal data must be processed lawfully, fairly, and transparently. This includes obtaining consent for processing personal data for commercial use. Really, it comes down to whether they're being compensated if it is being used for commercial use, but even maybe more so for a lot of the players that are recorded in this claim. It's the connection between betting and gambling industries and their personal data, and the fact that they don't have a right or are not being given a right to refusal of that use case. You might be thinking, as I have thought, who cares? They signed up for it. They get paid millions of dollars for it. This is all part of the contract. This is what it is, right? And the Premier League players are aware of what data is collected about them. That's stated at least from the policies of the league itself. However, they are not informed about who through those means might specifically have access to that data, who it's shared with specifically in terms of betting or gaming operations. And there is a reference in the privacy notice to sharing this data with third parties for commercial purposes, which could include obviously the betting and gambling, and that's probably what the league is hanging its hat on. But it may be alleged that that's just too vague, that that's not specific enough, and that those details need to be specified. I, for one, am incredibly interested to see how this develops and to see what comes of it. If these claims are recognized, if they're refuted, how specific we get into some of these details. At the heart of it all is that idea of players being able to object to their data being used in a way that they might morally be against or just wish to not have done. What kind of say do they have? And then you get into the idea of sensitive information. The clubs have a basis for gathering and using that data as employers, but it's difficult to see what kind of basis they would have to sell some player information to betting or gaming operators, and specifically without the players specifically consenting to that. It all comes back to that lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. First, is it lawful for them to do whatever they want with the player's data? And secondly, are they being transparent about that information and specifically what is being shared? And I love the fact that there are a group of players or former players that are calling that into question. I don't care how much money you make as an individual or as an athlete, you should still have basic privacy rights. And I love that this is being championed and fought for, even by millionaires. Because let's be honest, the data that's being used here, the data that's being sold, is not just for the top percent of players that are making tons of money. It's all the way from senior team members all the way down to under 21s. So we're talking about people that are up and coming, and what rights do they have under these umbrellas? And specifically, as I stated before, these policies that are in place, whether it's the Premier League's policy or the GDPR, are these things being enforced? And are they being enforced with their specific intent of being for the benefit of the individual, in this case, the players? I hope you found this as interesting and entertaining as I did. If you want more of the information or resources that I was pulling from, I'd be more than happy to share. Let me know your thoughts, comments as well on this topic in general. And I hope to probably do the same for another personal sports interest of mine, which is American football, as that season's about to kick off. So look for that video coming out as well.